Hi, this is Richard and Craig with our week 3 feedback video. So it's lovely to be back with you all, and yeah, thanks again for all your amazing comments.
Yeah, no, it's and some really juicy stuff this week, if I could put it that way. Lots of interesting topics and good questions and insights, I think.
Yeah, Craig, definitely. A lot of really interesting conversations happening around this idea that we can rewire our brain for happiness or even just contentedness.
Thank heavens for that.
I know, right? A client asked me just this week, he came in and said, I just read that personality is fixed. He's like 23 years old. He's like, it's fixed by the age of 20 and I don't think I can change anything. And I'm like, look, you're an introvert. You're probably never going to be an extrovert, but you can definitely change some habits. You know, whatever we give our attention to and time to becomes a habit. And that was very reassuring for him. I think it's just such a nice, healthy way of coming at, mental health and productivity. I mean, the idea that we can just retrain this innate negativity bias that we have. We talked at length in other feedback videos about this, but this biological mechanism where we just notice and remember and look for problems everywhere, and it helped us survive, but do we still need to be doing that? And maybe we could actually rewire that through, just deliberately paying attention to positive things, to pleasant things, to savouring things, to practicing gratitude. I mean, a lot of people keep gratitude journals now, or savour their food and just give their attention fully to pleasant experiences, which makes life richer, but actually moves the needle a little bit on that negativity bias.
Yeah, all of this about, personality is fixed and we are the way that we are is really based on a kind of, if we just keep doing the same thing we've always been doing in a low awareness, automatic pilot way, then yeah, it is all fixed because we're just reinforcing old patterns. And it really, those ideas about all these personality traits and so on being fixed doesn't take into account that we have the opportunity to bring awareness to what we're doing, the processes of thought, the behaviors, attitudes. Because once we practice something different, then something different starts to happen.
Yeah.
But if it's just business as usual without awareness, then yeah, it is all fixed. And history just keeps repeating itself, which is not always so optimistic.
I know that when I do personality questionnaires, I always get different scores, even on quite well validated ones. I think because I'm a meditator, I just maybe don't have a personality anymore or something, but it's kind of jumping around. So yeah. And Craig, the relationship with ourselves, that was really the main theme this week, the relationship we have with ourselves. And of course, that tends to bring up a lot of stuff for learners. So just
yeah, it is. And in a way, I think these practices really shine a spotlight on it. It makes us aware of, and I think this is a really useful thing, being aware of even that really negative stuff that we might say to ourselves and so on. Just the fact that awareness is coming into it means that there's already a sign of change. We have the opportunity to stand back and start to have a look at it. And many learners really noticing that we wouldn't treat others in the way that we often treat ourselves. And it's a kind of a strange conundrum, really. And things like perfectionism, if it's not perfect, then it's hopeless. And there's this kind of very extreme sort of thinking and so on. And one of the things about perfectionism, and I've worked in medical education for over 30 years now, and obsessive compulsive traits are very strong among doctors in the medical profession. And I kind of like to draw a distinction between the sort of excellence that comes about through paying attention. It is very good to improve what we do and how we do it, to prevent errors and mistakes. That's a very good thing. We don't want to think that mindfulness is, oh, well, anything goes. But the improvement that comes through attention and engagement and learning is different to the kind of perfectionism that comes about through this endless internal self-criticism and judgment, which is quite unmindful. And it actually just leads to anxiety.
Surgeon, do you think you could be a really good brain surgeon without being a total perfectionist? Do you think that just applying what you're talking about there could actually make someone really competent in that way?
I think that the really excellence comes about through attention and focus on task. The kind of perfectionism that leads to anxiety and self-criticism and so on is actually very unmindful. And because the attention's not on task, the attention is kind of consumed in a self-conscious sort of way, a negative talk kind of way, a criticizing, judging kind of way. And that actually predisposes to more errors and so on. And so I think it's really useful that a number of our learners are noticing the impact of perfectionism and the impact of self-criticism, which is different to the objective, impartial observing and noticing that comes with mindfulness.
You make me think of Roger Federer versus another player like maybe Kyrgios or even Leighton Hewitt, who seem to be, you'd imagine by watching them, quite tough on themselves, whereas Federer seems to have gotten past that anyway. I think early in his career he was probably self-critical, and he looks quite relaxed, doesn't he? So
yeah. So, and also a number of learners too going sort of further with noticing that there's self-talk, the negative self-talk and so on, which has been a really important topic.
Yeah, it's a bit of a revelation for people, isn't it? I mean, often it pushes people's buttons because the moment we start observing and tracking that, it's like, wow, a lot of what I'm saying to myself is actually quite harsh and in some cases quite negative. And I guess, often, as we've said many times in this course, the awareness sometimes precedes the acceptance. We become aware of something and later we learn to just allow it to be what it is, which of course is the complete picture of mindfulness. So when that awareness comes, the self-critical self-talk, it's like, oh, okay. Until that acceptance comes, I think it can be a bit of a challenge sometimes just to notice that and not react to it or judge it. Because of course, being self-critical about self-criticism is just self-criticism squared, right? So it just gets sort of worse and worse. But yeah, I guess as some of our learners have noticed, that the moment they are aware of that, they're no longer fully in it. And that's the really important point. You notice a particular type of thought and suddenly you're observing something rather than being lost in it. So that's the important point. So it's actually a very good moment. That's a moment of mindfulness right there.
Yeah, and there's a term like metacognition. You're standing back from your thoughts all of a sudden rather than being consumed by the thoughts. And some interesting reflections on, say, that is self-kindness really self-indulgence? And perhaps if we think in a kind of a way, we're learning to parent ourselves a little bit, because there's a pretty childlike part of our brains and a slightly more adult part of our brains. I suppose we call that executive functioning. But you see, kindness to a child is not letting the child do whatever it wants, because that's not very kind for a child. So there's a kind of discipline that's needed. But discipline's not about imposition and cruelty. Discipline's about learning to get some boundaries and structures and so on, so that we can be free of. Because if we don't have a kind of a level of mental self-discipline, then we are tyrannized by the endless stream of criticizing, judging, and worrying and ruminating, etc. So in a way, mindfulness is a kind of an inner discipline, and this it's not a self-indulgence, which is a kind of a turning away from, not responding to something that actually needs a limit set, for example. And they're quite different things. Yeah,
it's an important point that discipline equals freedom.
If it's wisely applied.
Yeah, if it's wisely applied, that's right. Yeah.
Not in a brutish kind of position sort of way.
No. Yeah. And of course, self-compassion and self-esteem was another topic that came up, which often this sort of challenges learners sort of a little bit. So that when we talk about self-esteem, there are different types, of course, different ways of getting good self-esteem. We can just focus on what we're good at. I mean, we can just notice things that we're good at. That's one way of doing it. I cited in the course some research by Kristin Neff, who's sort of the main self-compassion researcher, and she's done a lot of work comparing self-esteem and self-compassion. And the way that she describes self-esteem, the model that she's using, is one where we do focus on our achievements and how good we are at things, and quite often there is a bit of a comparison, a social comparison with others, how we're going compared to the rest of the class, so to speak. So certainly when we're defining self-esteem in that way, we can see that, to have good self-esteem, we have to be above average. And if everybody has to be above average, it just doesn't make sense mathematically. But of course, there are other ways of coming at that, aren't there?
Yeah. And there's a kind of intrinsic self-esteem that even if we make a mistake, as we all will at various times, if there's an intrinsic self-esteem, we still respect ourselves. We're still, we're a work in progress. It's okay. But there's a kind of intrinsic self-esteem as opposed to this sort of constant comparison. And and unfortunately, a lot of social media these days really reinforces this constant comparison with others. And and which can get us into a very negative spiral all the time, because it's all about the external. It's always dependent on other things, outside criteria, etc. And so there's been also about the discipline and mindful self-discipline as well, that some questions came up. And I think the kind of discipline that comes about through mindfulness, I sort of see it as a discipline in the moment, in the sense that we see something in that moment that needs to be done, and then we either respond in the moment and do it, or we ignore it. And then often when we ignore it, there's part of us that recognizes something needed to be done, and there's another part that's pulling the other way. And that's when we get caught in that sort of internal, oh, I'm good or bad, or should I, or shouldn't I, which is a never-ending internal debate. And that's not self-discipline. That's just being caught in default mode. But the kind of mindful self-discipline, I think, comes about through responding in the moment to what we see needs to be done, or responding in the moment when we notice that we need to stop. That's enough. Whatever it might be, eating, television, exercise. We could go too far with that as well. It's not, but that's a kind of a immediate, in the moment recognition of something.
Yeah, so in the end, perhaps it's just about what we give our time and attention to. And is that self-criticism? Is it junk values like TV and distraction, or is it actually something meaningful?
Yeah. Also, some interesting reflections on pain, and a number of learners finding that very helpful. And the principles, whether it's emotional pain or physical pain, are really the same, but finding that very helpful, which is great, because it is a paradox that increasing awareness, even of something uncomfortable, can actually be a big part of the solution.
A certain type of awareness we'd add to that, wouldn't we?
That's right, yeah. Not the awareness with elaboration and reactivity, but the awareness with a sort of a calm, non-reactive sort of noticing. And because that's where the suffering mostly is what we add to the experience.
You make it sound so easy, Craig. Just notice the emotional pain and don't react to it. And it's a whole practice, isn't it? It's a moment practice to be with discomfort without adding the evaluation and judgment and all those layers to it that create suffering.
I remember when I was about 19, I used to play a lot of basketball. And I can remember one time, sprained ankles were, grist for the mill for basketball. I remember one time really, really, sprained ankle. And it came off, limped off the court. And I can remember sitting there at the end of the game, and the sensation was very strong. And I don't know why, but I just thought, I'm going to do an experiment. Just going to do a little experiment. One moment, feel the pain and the tension it created. And I thought, what I might do is just then notice the sensation, but without an attitude to it, as a completely impartial sort of observer of it. No attitude to it at all. And I noticed that the experience of the sensation changed profoundly. And then I thought I'll switch back and now feel it like it's happening to me, and then switch back and just notice it. And that sort of switching of attitude made a profound difference to the experience of it. I don't know why I did that experiment, but it kind of made a lot of sense to me at the time.
Craig, you never cease to surprise me with your mindfulisms. I mean, it's amazing, isn't it, somehow?
Well,
yeah, it's just... But it does make sense when you say it. It really makes sense. Why don't we learn to relate to life like that? Yeah,
but there's some uncomfortable stuff going on for all of us at the moment. And so in a sense, the mindfulness is very simple, but it is not that easy, because it is not easy to be with stuff that we find really uncomfortable. And it's been so great to hear so many learners finding the mindfulness a really stabilising factor in these challenging and uncertain times.
Yeah, well, it's certainly a good opportunity for practicing all the things we're talking about here.
Yeah.
So next week, we're going to introduce a different type of meditation called choiceless awareness practice, and that'll make sense what that is. But that's really the fruition of your mindfulness practice there, as you learn to just be with whatever's happening in each moment. And we're also going to look at mindful ethics and values, how we can learn to listen deeply to ourselves to really start to live more in alignment with what's important, with our purpose. And we're going to talk, of course, about how to bring mindfulness and maintain it in our daily life. So we look forward to seeing you next week. is what happens behind the scenes.